Hey everyone, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and today we're going to be tackling one of the most requested videos I have had, which is a disc brake conversion. So stay tuned. Now, like I said, we are going to be tackling a disc brake conversion on a friend's Classic Mini. Obviously, my car already has disc brakes, so for the longest time, I wasn't able to do this conversion for you. However, a friend of mine has graciously decided to leave his car with me today so I can convert it to discs. He gets a disc conversion and I get a video. But before we get started, I do want to say a huge thank you to this episode's sponsors, that's 7 Mini Parts. They are the ones who provided this full disc brake conversion kit, which I'm going to go over here in just a minute, but it is a complete kit so you can get out in your garage, make the whole conversion and be done with it, and know that you have good quality parts. Also, a big thank you to Venom Steel Gloves, who is currently running a giveaway with me right now. If you guys are in North America and would like to enter for a chance to win a box of these Venom gloves, the link is in the description below. And finally, a huge shout out to my patrons who help make these videos possible and help fund big projects like this and other fun stuff here in the future. Now, jump over to the bench here with me and let's take a look at these disc brakes, and I'm going to give you a little rundown of what we're working with. Now, to start off, what we're looking at here is, well, the basics of your kit. There are tons of bits and bobs that come with it as well to help, install your ball joints and all the various smaller pieces. But what I'm going to show you guys here is the main large pieces that are going to come with the kit. First off, you'll find your disc. This is a flat disc. This is made for like road use. You can get drilled and slotted discs for additional stopping power. But in this case, my friend is going to be using this car mostly on the road, and this is going to be more than enough stopping power for it. Next, we have the disc brake hub. This is really important, and one thing that I think a lot of people get confused about. On the front of your car, this sits up at the front, and on an earlier car you have a drum that sits over this and a hub that's made to suit the drum. When you upgrade to a disc brake setup, you have to replace the hub as well as the braking system so that this can all work together with your drive shaft. You have a whole new continuous velocity joint, which I'm going to show you. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. And then you have your drive flange that sits on the end here. And then finally, you have your actual caliper. Now, the caliper we're using in this case is a Mini Spares 4-pot caliper. These things are awesome. It's an alloy, so it's super light, but you're given 4 pots or 4 pistons. These pistons are what create the stopping force. So now the cool thing about the 7 Mini kit is that on all their kits for disc brakes, you get this stuff, your hub, your disc, your flange, various other things that are off screen, but you can choose to pick a different braking caliper. So if you want something that is more period specific, you can pick up a Cooper S set of disc brakes, which for the most part is really just this caliper that is different. It has 2 pistons instead of 4. In the case of my friend's car, I encouraged him to go ahead and get the 4-pot braking system. I think he's going to be a lot happier with it. However, the Cooper S braking system does fit more smaller wheels. So this, you'll have to take into consideration your wheels. One additional thing is this is a 7.5-inch disc. And that is going to allow us to use 10-inch wheels on his car, which is what he has currently. But you can even upgrade your disc to something like an 8-inch disc. 8.9, I think, is the largest you can get, and you get tons of stopping power with a much bigger caliper and disc setup. But 7.5 works great. Now, just one other thing to mention is that this kit does come with the new continuous velocity joints. These are your new CV joints that sit on the outer part of your drive shaft. This is what allows things to spin and to pivot and to shift and allows that power to continue to get delivered to the wheels. It does come with wheel bearings. It comes with, like I said, everything you need. Now let's jump out to the car and take a look at what we are going to be replacing. Now, unfortunately, there was a little bit of a mishap with this car prior to deciding to do this whole disc brake conversion. You guys might be able to see here, we've got a little bit of damage on our upper wing here, the sill panel, and there used to be an arch here, which no longer is in place. Now, what happened is some of these lug nuts ended up kind of loosening themselves. The threads on them were pretty trashed, and over time, vibration kind of worked those bolts out a little bit, and there was a bit of a catastrophe, and my friend lost this wheel while he was driving down the road at about 45 miles per hour, which is pretty scary. Basically what happened is the lugs came undone, the wheel popped off, went down the road, a car hit the ground, and unfortunately at that point he didn't have any brakes, the car would not stop, so he basically had to just ride it out, rode it into a parking lot, and then ultimately got it towed. So today we are going to be removing the old drum brakes to replace the whole hub assembly, but while we're underneath on this side, because this is the wheel that came off, we're going to take a look and make sure that there's no excess damage down there. If there is, that'll get addressed on maybe another episode, we shall see. But hopefully, once we get this wheel off, it's not too bad and there are not too many problems or any problems. So, first thing that we need to do is jack up the car. Don't forget your jack stands. All right, and so with that, we are looking at the front hub assembly for a drum brake mini. Now there's definitely some damage here to our drum, as you can see where it rolled and it skidded across the ground here. The back sill actually looks okay. There doesn't seem to be any damage there, as well as our whole assembly for the radiator and stuff. Unfortunately, there is some rust there. I'm sure that the drop didn't help that. And then finally, our tie rod end right here, that has a little bend in it. One other thing I did notice is you can see these bolts are just rubbed down almost to nothingness on the bottom end of our ball joints. So obviously all this stuff is getting replaced, but it is really nice to see that there isn't an excess amount of damage here. Now, the first thing I'm gonna do is take the cotter pin out of this bolt right here. In order to undo this, we are gonna need to put the wheel back on, set the car back down, and really torque against this, because this bolt right here does a lot of work, and it is almost always really tight on there. And then once we get the disc assembly on there, it's got to go on even tighter than it is now. So let's get started by first off pulling that cotter pin out. So you guys can see here, I put some bricks in here. Hopefully that'll chalk it a little bit, and we'll see if we can get it undone this way. Really all we need to do is break it, so just to make sure that it's loose, and then we should be able to unbolt it and get the rest of the stuff off. Also, I do have the parking brake set, and hopefully this will come off without too much fuss. All right, there we go. So that bolt is now broken free. It does take a lot of force. So don't worry if it's taking a lot of work to get this off. This bolt often is seized on here as well. It does hold the wheel bearing in there, so it has a big job. All right, so now with that loose, we're gonna go ahead and remove this bolt the rest of the way. And we'll get ourselves a little pry bar here, and it should help us get this drum the rest of the way off. Unless I can wiggle it loose. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Okay, so in this case, what ended up happening, because obviously we took that nut off, we actually took the whole flange off with our drum assembly, and that's because these studs were so worn and so bent. So the whole assembly came off here, which means that we have exposed the wheel bearing right here. But that's not really a huge deal when you're doing a disc conversion like this, because basically all of this stuff is going away. But you can see here, we've got our wheel bearing. This is our CV joint that fits inside our drum assembly. We do have a new one, like I mentioned earlier, for our disc assembly. This is gonna be fun to remove. I'll show you guys that here in a little while. But before we go any further, because we will be disconnecting the brake lines here, I'm gonna show you guys a small trick when you're working with brake systems to help avoid the excess loss of fluid. So let's jump up to the engine bay and I'll show you. Now, as you can see here, we have our two master cylinders. We have our clutch master cylinder and then our brake master cylinder here. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a vacuum seal on this lid here. And the way that we do that is by taking the lid, sticking it into a plastic bag just like this, and then we're gonna screw it back on. Now you're obviously not gonna wanna forget this, but by doing this, what we're doing is creating a vacuum on the actual braking system so that when we disconnect the lines down at the hubs, we lose a lot less fluid. We're still gonna lose fluid, but it's not gonna be excess amounts. And then when we rebleed the system, it's gonna be a little bit easier. All right, and so now with that brake system prepared for disassembly, we can start disassembling the things on our hub here. First thing is our steering rack, then we're gonna disconnect our ball joints, and we're also gonna need to disconnect the brake line here. You can see this rubber brake line, that's gonna need to get disconnected from the brakes as well. Expect a little bit of fluid loss, and brake fluid is corrosive, so it will take paint off of things, so just keep that in mind while you're disassembling everything. Now one thing that you are also gonna need is a ball joint splitter. This is gonna allow you to split the ball joint here because it does bind up here, as well as your steering rack here. So this just goes on like this. And we tighten her up, use our adjustable wrench. There we go. That'll break free. You kind of push that off to the side. And we're gonna need to do the same thing for this nut and probably the one on the bottom. The one on the bottom is gonna be quite a challenge because that is totally melted down. Now with that loose, you can actually see this is our drive shaft here with our CV joint. This CV joint is ultimately gonna get replaced. We can't really get that out until we get that other bottom bolt out. So let's get down there and see what we can do. Now we had to do a good bit of work here because this is what the bottom ball joint nut looked like when I took it off. So you can see what ended up happening when the wheel came off is all the weight of your car rested down on that bolt. And he got the car pulled over as quickly as he could. However, there was not much nut left on that. I mean, you can see this is what a normal nut looks like. This is one of the new ones that's going back on. And that is what's left of the nut on his bottom ball joint. Now, I did break this loose already, the same way I did with the top side with the ball joint splitter. Now our whole hub is loose, free, and we can disconnect our brake line. Now you can see here, I went ahead and loosened the brake line so that I can spin the hub because these brake lines tend to get a little bound up. They're hard to unscrew if you don't remove the hub. I probably look like a crazy person right now rotating this hub around, but there we go. So you can see I am losing a little fluid. That's a-okay. Gonna put a little rag underneath here so that we can collect that. And I am gonna get my little pincher here. I'm gonna pinch this off. All right, those were a good purchase. Those were like $5 at AutoZone, and you can see that's working pretty damn well. So now we have a good look at everything here. Let's go ahead and clean this up. Everything is looking pretty good. Obviously this has a little bend in it, so that'll need to get replaced at some point. But overall, not too bad. Now, this outer CV is where we're gonna run into some hardship when we're getting this out here, because what ends up liking to happen is when you pull this, your inner CV is gonna wanna come out with it. So how do we get this off without taking the whole drive shaft apart? Well, first thing that we gotta do is break off this boot, which is already pretty worn. So we'll cut that off. Fair warning for the stuff that's in here, this grease is super, super strong. It smells terrible and it will stain anything it gets on. So just keep that in mind. Gloves are a really good thing to have in this scenario because these boots hold in a lot of gross, smelly grease. Now the hope here is that we're gonna be able to get this outer CV off. And normally the way that you do that is by taking a hammer and giving this a good old whack from the other side. There is a small circlip in there. So it stays expanded when you're driving, when it's on and assembled. And what'll happen is when you hit it, it's gonna contract the circlip down and it's gonna allow the whole assembly to pop off the end of your drive shaft. Now when this is not on the car, it's as simple as putting this in a vice grip and giving a good whack and then it'll come off. However, In this scenario, that's not going to be the case because, well, it's on your car, and there's really two methods to get it off. One with that hammer, or you got to take the inner CVs, the pot joints, you got to take those out of the transmission, out, and obviously drain all of your oil. So I'd like to avoid doing that, so let's see if we can get this off without doing that. And there we go. Outer CV is off. I'm super pleased that I could get that done. What I ended up doing is using a vice grip to bind up the drive shaft so it couldn't move out. Only the outer CV could. Now, this is difficult. This was not an easy thing to do, but you can do it with normal hand tools. So I'm excited to say this is now ready for our disc assembly. But first, what we're going to do is get all this stuff really nice and clean because, well, we want a clean system to go back on here. And what better time to do it while it's disassembled? So you do also have the opportunity to look at the circlip that's in here. The one that is on here is still in really great shape, so I'm going to go ahead and reuse that. Those are something that you can reuse, but just make sure that it's got a nice amount of spring and it actually sits outside or proud of the actual spindles here. If it doesn't, then you're going to need to get a new one. Now that we have most of the free grease off of that, let's take a little quick look at the difference between these two CV joints. They are almost identical. You can see here they look virtually identical, except the disc brake has a much larger shaft here than your drum brakes do. This is much stronger. This is one of the many reasons you would want to upgrade to a disc brake system, but the holes on the back, same thing, slots right on to your drive shaft. So we got to take this off here, but don't forget you have to put the boot on your drive shaft first. Let me assure you that forgetting to put this boot on is one of the most frustrating things once you've got the whole, outer CV back on, because you ultimately have to repeat the steps of taking the old CV off. I'm just going to push that up out of the way. And these come pre-greased, but I generally like to add a little bit more grease in here. Now keep in mind this needs to be high temp, high velocity grease that you put in here. So we'll take our little plastic cover off here, and actually, you know what? I'm gonna change my gloves. All right, and so in my case, I'm gonna be using a fully synthetic disc brake wheel bearing grease. All right, and with that greased up, you literally line up those spindles and give this a whack on there. All right, so now we have our new CV joint on. We're gonna slide our boot right on over this. Very nice. Now there's a small notch that this is gonna sit down into, so you're gonna wanna make sure that you hit that. And then your CV joint is gonna come with a very specific kind of locking system here. Now, I'm a big fan of these, but you have to have the right tool in order to tighten these down. So I'm gonna go ahead and set these on here, but let's take a look at this. So we have our new band clamp. That's what these are called here. And this band clamp has notches in it. Let's see if I can get a better view of that. This band clamp has notches in it, and when you tighten it up, you have two little locking tabs and they sit down into these holes. But you're like, well, that never gets tight. And you're right, because you need a special tool to pinch this right here, and that brings it the rest of the way tight. So you basically get this as tight as you possibly can get it by hand, and then you come back through with your tool, pinch it off, and it is tight, it is sealed for what feels like an eternity. I think these are so much better than zip ties, and you'll have much more success keeping your CV boot from leaking, from getting debris into it, using these band clamps than you will a regular zip tie, in my opinion. So here are the little pinchers. They squeeze that little tab up at the top and tighten it down. And there we go, band clamp number 1 installed. Let's go ahead and get number 2 back here. So now we get to install our hubs. Now, one thing that we are gonna be doing in this job, which I'm not gonna talk about, is shimming your ball joints, because there is a really good video by Steveston Motor Co. where they tackled shimming those and installing those ball joints. So if you haven't seen that, definitely recommend checking that out. I'm gonna get my ball joints installed, and then we'll come back out here and install the hub. And so with our ball joints installed, shimmed up and ready to roll, it is now time to install our wheel bearings. Now, wheel bearings are fun. There's something that needs to be done correctly, because if you don't do it correctly, you can have some pretty catastrophic results on your car. Now, these are Timken tapered roller bearings. Now, what that means is that the bearings themselves are tapered. You can see they have rollers in here instead of balls. This is a much more efficient method. And then you have two races that are tapered, where these set down inside and can spin around inside that bearing race. One thing you're gonna wanna take note of is that we have a spacer. This spacer needs to go in between the two wheel bearings. So one goes in like this, the other comes in the other side, and this needs to be in between those two bearings to prevent any sort of damage to your bearings themselves. This creates a buffer, a safety buffer zone, where it won't cause any problems. Now we have this dust shield and a backside rubber fitting. The way you know it's the back is it has a small lip on it that this dust shield is gonna sit down on top of. So the opening, the gap inside your dust shield is gonna go inwards, and then the dust shield goes on the top. Now to start off, let's go ahead and put our bearing race in. Now, it's not gonna be as simple as just like, whoop, just gonna pop it in there like that. This needs to get hammered down in there, and the easiest way I have found to get these down in here is with an old bearing. All right, and so what you can see here is this is the old roller bearing race. This is the new tapered bearing race. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set my roller bearing race on top of there, since I don't have to reuse it. And then I can use that as my tapping surface so I don't damage anything. And I can tap that new race down all the way into place. All right, so the way that you'll know that it's all the way down in there is that little lip down there will be totally flush on the bearing face here. You can see the lip a little bit better here without the race in there, but that's the general idea. So now we need to do the same thing for the other side, and then we'll be able to install the bearings. Okay, so now once you have both those bearing races in, the next step is to install your bearings and install your dust shields. So this is pretty easy, but before you can install one of these bearings, you need to load the bearing with grease. Now, this is a very messy process, but it has to be done. So some kits will come with bearing grease with them, others will not, and in this case, it did not. So we're gonna take a full synthetic wheel bearing grease. It has to be rated for wheel bearings. Otherwise you cannot use it. It'll just degrade and it won't work properly. So the way I do this is just by pressing this grease down through the races. And really you just wanna cake this stuff into the bearing itself. You gotta get it nice and loaded up with grease on both sides. And as you can see, extremely messy. Now, you don't need to worry about using too much grease. This is an area of your car that spins 100% of the time. If your car is moving, this is spinning. So, getting too much grease in there is not really a thing. But once you get it down in there, you're gonna wanna spin it around, roll those roller bearings, and get that grease worked in there. And really, once you do that, the only thing left to do is to put the dust shield on. Now, of course, hands are messy. What I'm gonna do is go ahead and preload the other bearing, just so that I don't have to be super greasy and waste a whole bunch of gloves. All right, so now with that out of the way, we are going to install our dust shield. So dust shield goes on with the lip side facing backwards so that this will meet and mate with it. This will just get pressed in down on the back side here, and you're gonna wanna press it all the way down into this, this bearing face here. All right, and with that one pressed all the way in, we're gonna do the same thing on the front side, but we can't really do it yet until we put our spacer in. So spacer goes in, just like that. And now we can put our front bearing in, and then our front dust shield. All right, so both of those are now in place. We have our wheel bearing assembly assembled. Now when you're doing this, don't forget your dust shield goes on the back side of your hub there, and this will thread right through the center. There we go. Now also while you're doing this, take extra care not to let any debris get in here, and to make sure that your wheel bearing doesn't pop out when you thread this through. Now if you have a keen eye, you might notice something is missing up here. Now what that is the piece that your steering rack attaches to. Now this kit doesn't come with that because it's presumed that you have one on your existing hub. So in our case here, we are going to need to get that off of our existing hub and apply that here. Now, it should be as simple as unbolting that, so I'm gonna unbolt it, and then I'll stick it on here. So now it's the fun part. We're gonna put our disc on, but before we can put this disc on, we've got to clean it with a brake parts cleaner. They come pre-lubed with a whole bunch of oil and protectants to make sure that they don't get messed up beforehand, but we need to clean it before we put brake pads and things like that on it. All right, and with our disc clean, we're gonna wanna thread that on there, just like that. All right, and our drive shaft is kind of popping out there at the end. Get your taper washer, put that on, and then your castle nut. Now, you're probably not gonna get this all the way tight while it's off the car like this because, well, it's just gonna spin with your drive shafts. So, one tip, if you have center caps on your wheels, what I would recommend is tightening this up as much as you can while it's on the car like this, and then setting the car back down and tightening both sides when you've done the conversion on both sides and you're done. This is just gonna make it a lot easier. You can torque it down to the crazy foot-pound rating that it needs to be torqued to, and just make your life easier. Okay, and so now we have our caliper. These calipers are made for one side only. See these two nipples right here? One on each side of the caliper? These are bleed nipples for your brake line. So the first thing that I like to do is go ahead and unscrew the back side here where the brake line, where the feed line is gonna go in. It's normally closed so that you don't get any debris or anything in there. And as you can see, with the caliper loose, it's much easier to start the threading on your brake line and screw your brand new caliper in. Now, with that hand tight, we're gonna move it up here to meet your new disc, but you're gonna see it kind of moves a little bit. You're gonna need spacers in between the caliper and the actual hub. So let's grab those. They came with the kit, and these go in a specific orientation. These spacers are gonna go in right here on the inside of your caliper, as you can see right there. All right, and last but not least, we're gonna tighten that brake hose on the back side. And that's just gonna take a few tightens. Don't over tighten this thing because brake hoses have a tendency to cross thread and to snap. It's looking good, no leaks. So now we have a disc brake hub installed on the front without brake pads, and we haven't bled it yet. One thing I am gonna say is I have done a video using the Gunson Power Bleed system, which works really, really well. That's what I'm gonna be using to bleed these. And I'm not gonna cover it in this video just because I've done a whole video on how to bleed those. So the last thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna jump to the front of this caliper. I'm gonna show you guys how to put your pads in, and then this thing will be ready to get put back down on the ground, tighten these castle nuts down, cotter pin, and then it'll be ready to roll. Now, one thing that you're gonna run into with these 4-pot calipers, and these ones are no different, it's that these standard brake pads don't always work for them. And the reason they don't work is because these little tabs right here prevent it from sitting all the way flush down in there. So you can see it kind of sticks out a little bit. So we gotta cut those off. Funny enough, Mini Spares actually includes a sheet of paper that says, hey, you might need to cut this stuff off right here, which I find a little funny, but you know, whatever. Also, the pad set that comes with it will come with a brake wear sensor. This is intended to tell you when it's time to replace the brakes. However, this model car does not have that, so we're just gonna trim these suckers off. Now, you should only need to clearance this on the inside. The outside one should fit okay, but let's go ahead and test this out after a little bit of cutting, and boom, that fits perfectly. So we're gonna take it back out because we need to apply a synthetic brake lubricant to help avoid unnecessary squeaking, things like that. And then we also need to pull these in a little bit here. All right, so I find the easiest way to apply this without getting the pads messed up is to apply it directly to the back side of your brake pad, just like this. Take extra care not to get it on the pad itself, because if you do, the brakes will not work. There we go. All right, and that one was a little tight only because the pistons haven't been pressed out all the way yet. That should get remedied once we break these in a little bit, but let's go ahead and get our cotter pins and we'll pass it through here and then we'll be done. All right, and so there we have it. Brake pads installed, brake line reinstalled. Our bleed nipples are closed right now. And so I'm gonna repeat these steps on the other side of the car, and then we'll set it down on the ground, tighten these castle nuts, and then we'll be done. So the torque spec for this is about 200 Newton meters or about 150 foot-pound. Now the way that this works is that you need to torque this nut down, and there's a hole that goes across this bolt here that your cotter pin's gonna ultimately go through. You need to line that up. Now, the way that you line this up is you tighten it to the torque spec, and then if the hole's not lined up, you tighten it more. You never loosen it to get that hole to line up. So tighten it more. Does the hole line up? No. Tighten more. Does the hole line up? No. Keep doing that until you can get the cotter pin through. Keep in mind, you probably will not be able to get the cotter pin on with the wheel on. So we're gonna torque this down, jack it back up, and then take the wheel off, put the cotter pin through, and then we'll be done. We can test drive it and make sure that it stops.
Tonight, I mustn't think of him. Music might go please tonight.
So you can see I've hit my torque spec. Now I'm gonna continue to tighten it because the hole is not lined up.
Your lilting melody, ragtime, jazz, and swing, any old thing to help me ease the pain. That's our little.
All right, so now we have it lined up, and our cotter pin is gonna be able to go through right there. Obviously, I gotta take the wheel off. So we're gonna jack it up. We'll take one last look at the brakes since they're all done, and then we'll wrap this video up.
Your lilting melody, ragtime, jazz, and swing, any old thing to help me ease the pain.
Now we're looking at our final assembled disc brake, and that is looking super sweet. So we have brake pads installed, we have our caliper installed, we bled the caliper here and on the nipple on the back here. That was left out. If you guys are thinking about tackling this job, it is something that you have to do. You do need to bleed the brakes in order to complete this. So check out my other video if you're curious about that. But castle nut is tightened down. We have our cotter pin in place, and this Mini is ready to stop. Now, one other thing I didn't show you guys is greasing your fittings on the ball joints. I've done that before. It's pretty simple. You just need a grease gun and you hook it up to the little nipples back here and grease it up. But that is looking pretty sweet. I think you guys probably agree. So let's head back into the shop and finish this up. All right, so that wraps up this episode of Classic Mini DIY. I hope you guys found it helpful. It's a good solid day's work. If you're wanting to tackle this on your own, you can expect at least 4 to 5 hours to get the job complete, depending on if you run into any snags or things like that. I'm really excited about these brakes on my friend's car. He's gonna really enjoy them. I tested them out and man, they really stop. So if you guys are looking for a conversion set like this, you can pick it up at 7 Mini Parts. This kit was purchased from 7 Mini, and we tacked on the Mini Spares 4-pot calipers to really get that extra stopping power for him. Also, a big shout out to my patrons who support this channel and help fund projects like the 998 series that's in progress right now. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel, head over to patreon.com/ClassicMiniDIY. There's lots of cool perks there. And then finally, I just want to remind you guys that the fuel bibs are now shipping. They're out of the pre-order stage, and if you guys are interested in picking one up for your Classic Mini, head over to merch.classicminidiy.com. But until the next time, until the next episode, enjoy those minis and motor on.